Good day, mates. It's sadness. Welcome to our last presentation of this virtual cruise, or this cruise year anyway. Last month found us in India, where we kind of learned about its culture and its many and complex religions. Then we took a side trip to the Taj Mahal, gaining a better understanding of the Mughals, the British Raj, and the Sultans. Today we're going to sail from India to Australia, and then we're going to head home for the holidays. Our motor vessel PVE has held up pretty well so far this year, but we're going to have to dry dock her for a while in San Francisco. Let's start with Australia's geology, and then we're going to segue into some more interesting animals on the planet. And after that, we're going to talk about the Aborigines and the convicts. Both groups have had a pretty large impact on that country. What?
Not loud enough.
Next year, we may have more time so we can visit additional highlights. Australia is pretty big. It's diverse and it's matchless. Including Tasmania, Australia is roughly the same size or equal in area to the lower 48 states of the U.S. Compared to all 7 continents, Australia is the smallest, but it is not the oldest. Geologically, it's the same age as all the other continents. For the most part, Australia is a flat, dry desert. Millions of years of erosion on the Australian continent has leveled the surface. Only Antarctica is more arid. That's a little bit of trivia for you. An exception to the relatively level topography is the Great Dividing Range along the east coast. That occurred as the Australian tectonic plate collided with the Pacific plate. And you remember, we talked a little bit about this, how when the plates collide, it's kind of similar to the way the Appalachian and the Himalayan mountains were formed. It pushes up, if you push in from each end, it kind of buckles up in the center. Every known rock type from over 3.8 billion years of the Earth's history is found here, including the largest rock in the world. It's one of Australia's most distinguished and recognizable natural landmarks, rising up from a flat desert plain. Uluru has a total circumference of nearly 6 miles. It stands about 1,140 feet high, and 2/3 of the bulk is underground. This sandstone monolith clocks in at about 570 million years old. In 1873, surveyor William Gosse sighted it and named it in honor of the then Chief Secretary of South Australia, Sir Henry Ayres. Well, after a whole lot of changes in the way that people looked at things down there, it returned back to its original Aboriginal name, Uluru. Most of Australia's plant and animal life had their beginnings in ancient Pangaea. We talked about that way back near the beginning of the year in an earlier lecture that we gave about the origin of the Earth's continents. 400 million years ago, Australia broke away from India, Antarctica, and Africa. But at the time, all of them were covered in subtropical rainforest. Climate change caused temperatures to drop about 20 million years ago. An arid climate and poor soil led to some pretty amazing adaptations for Australia's animals and plants. Alfred Russel Wallace was a naturalist who saw a difference between the plants and animals in the northwestern and southeastern parts of Indonesia. He mapped a boundary known as the Wallace Line. For example, on the east side of the Wallace Line, which is on the right here, beech trees were replaced by Australia's eucalyptus or gum trees and acacia trees. These trees adapted by growing very hard leaves with a thick outer layer that reduced water loss. Another example is the diverse wildlife that is found east of the line. Of 200,000 animal species in Australia, nearly 6% are, or 96, excuse me, not nearly 6, 96% are invertebrates. The largest group, insects, make up 3/4 of the world's known species. There are 4 native frogs, and that includes the colorful Corroboree frog. That's an Aboriginal word that means gathering, and in those gatherings the attendants paint themselves with yellow markings that look like that frog. Australia is home to about 800 bird species. The more unique ones include the emu and the southern cassowary. The cassowaries are the 3rd largest birds in the world, and they're only smaller than ostriches and emus. Cassowaries belong to a group of flightless birds, and they don't have a keel on their sternum like turkeys and chickens and so on do. That's that when you carve a turkey or a chicken, you see that ridge down the breastbone. And those are found in almost all flying birds. And you can kind of think of that if you remember back to when you carved your own turkey, or maybe chicken. Cassowaries are very shy, but when they're provoked, they're capable of inflicting pretty grave injuries. Sometimes that's even fatal to dogs and occasionally people. One of its toes has a very long, straight nail which can sever an arm or fillet your abdomen pretty much with ease. Anyway, the cassowary is an endangered species, and sometime if you catch me in the hall, ask about a prank my loving wife played on me over cassowaries in Sydney. Kookaburras are a kingfisher, and they have stout, compact bodies. They sport short necks, long pointed bills, and they have short legs. They're found where food can easily be acquired, so you kind of watch for them around the buffet. The kookaburra is known for its call, and it sounds like laughter. Because of this, they're sometimes called laughing jackasses. You can hear that distinctive sound play electronically at many crosswalks in Australia when it's safe to cross the street. Well, let's kind of listen to it just for a minute. And that really tells you it's safe to go across the street, doesn't it? Australia has 2 species of crocodile. Freshwater crocodiles, or freshies, are found only in northern Australia. They're famed for their meat and leather. They can be distinguished from their larger cousin by their very long, thin, narrow snout. On the other hand, saltwater crocodiles, known as salties, can and do kill people. They have a very broad snout, and the salties are the largest of all the crocodiles in the world, and they can grow to over 21 feet in length. These things can weigh in at maybe a ton or more. Now, I have a question. Who weighs these things? The platypus is a semi-aquatic animal found in eastern Australia and Tasmania. Now, the platypus has a pretty unusual appearance. This egg-laying, duck-billed, beaver-tailed, otter-footed, poisonous mammal stumped naturalists when they first found it. At the time of discovery, many naturalists considered it to be just an elaborate hoax pulled off by some taxidermist. Anyway, it is one of the few poisonous mammals found on Earth, and the male platypi have a spur on their hind feet that has venom in it that can cause pretty severe pain. Australia is home to most of the world's marsupials. They first appeared here perhaps 56 million years ago. Now, marsupials are pouched animals, kind of like the wallaby or the kangaroo, and all of them have front opening pouches. They give live birth, but they do not have long gestation periods as other mammals do. Instead, when they give birth, the young animal is essentially still a helpless embryo. It climbs from the mother's birth canal to the nipples that are found inside the pouch. Then it grabs on and it continues to develop, often for weeks or sometimes months, depending on the species. Kangaroos and wallabies belong to a subgroup called macropods. That means that their hind legs are larger than their front limbs. They have long muscular tails, and those are for balance. They once roamed Australia pretty much unthreatened by predators. That changed after the English showed up and brought dogs, and we won't go there. Kangaroos and wallabies are most active every day from dusk until dawn. The red kangaroos are found on the flat open plains. The grays prefer dense shrub and forests. The tree kangaroos are abundant in the mountain rainforest of northeast Australia. Wombats and koalas have pouches that open toward the back of the mother. Wombats live on the ground and they feed on grasses and roots. They use rodent-like front teeth and powerful claws to dig their burrows. Though often called the koala bear, this cuddly little animal is not a bear at all. It is a marsupial. After giving birth, the female carries her baby in her pouch for about 6 months. When the infant emerges, it rides either on its mother's back or clings to her belly, and it will accompany her everywhere she goes until it's about a year old. Koalas live in eastern Australia, where the eucalyptus trees they love are most plentiful. In fact, they rarely leave the trees. They eat so much eucalyptus that they take on kind of a distinctive smell or odor. It's from the oil that's in the leaf, and it kind of smells a little bit like cough drops. During the day, the koalas normally doze. They're tucked into the forks and nooks up in the trees, and they might sleep for 18 hours. Koalas don't drink much water, but they get their moisture from the eucalyptus leaves that they eat. They feed mainly at night. The koalas have sharp claws and opposable digits that help them stay up in the trees and stay aloft. Sadly, though, recent extreme wildfires, some that are going on right now, have put these beautiful little animals in grave danger of extinction. Today's Aboriginal Australians are believed to have descended from the very first people to leave Africa. That migration most likely occurred during a period of low sea level some 75,000 years ago. A recent genetic study found that the Aboriginal people of Australia may be the oldest continuous culture on the planet. The research found more charcoal sediments coinciding with those first people's arrival on the continent. And that suggests that man-made fires may have helped establish today's forests, because the ash kind of acts like a fertilizer. Shown here is a 42,000-year-old skeleton known as Mungo Man. He was named after a dry lake bed that was west of Sydney in a place called Mungo Lake. The remains were covered with red ochre, and that was a rock that was commonly used for ritualistic burial purposes. He and Mungo Lady, probably not related, are the earliest human remains found in Australia. Mungo Lady was a partially cremated body that was determined to be 40,000 years old. She is the oldest known human, or the earliest known human, that was known to have been cremated. The Australian Aboriginal people left evidence of their lives depicted in art and music. Some paintings are up to 20,000 years old. That makes their artwork among the oldest of any group of people on Earth. Their rock art typically represents human relations with the environment and the close personal bond they have with their spiritual heritage. It gives us information about social activities, economy, environmental change, and religion. All of the paints that they used, hematite, that's a reddish iron oxide, lasts the longest. That's why the majority of the old paintings that you see today are pretty much completely red. To make the paint, they crushed pigments on a stone pallet, and then they mixed them with water to make a paste. They used brushes from human hair, reeds, feathers, or just chewed sticks. Sometimes they would use their mouths to blow wet pigment around objects, such as their hands, to make them kind of a stencil. In the early 1970s, a white school teacher introduced the dot painting technique. Most of the Aboriginal art that you see today in Australia features these dots. One of the more unique features of the Australian Aboriginal culture is their belief in Dreamtime. Dreamtime is based on animism. It's a religious faith where objects, places, creatures all possess a very distinct spiritual essence. Spirits are everywhere. They're in plants, rocks, mountains, or other entities of natural environment. They even are found in thunder and wind and shadows. The best-known musical instrument in Australia is the didgeridoo. It's a unique wind instrument believed to have been developed around 15,000 years ago, and it's still in widespread use today. The didgeridoo is made by picking out slightly flared young eucalyptus tree trunks that are about 4.5 or so feet in length. Then it's all been hollowed out by white ants or termites. The outer layer of the tree contains chemicals from the eucalyptus that actually repels the insects, leaving the vacant tube. After being cut down, the hollowed wood is cleaned out with a stick. Its outside is refined by scraping and painting with traditional designs. The blowing end is smoothed by adding a rim of beeswax as a mouthpiece. Traditionally, a didgeridoo is played only by men. They use a special breathing technique called circular breathing. This requires breathing in through the nose and simultaneously expelling stored air out of the mouth using the tongue and cheeks. And no, I have not mastered that skill. Some modern didgeridoo players can play continuously for more than 40 minutes without apparently taking a breath. A 2005 study in the British Medical Journal found that learning and practicing the didgeridoo helped reduce snoring and obstructive sleep apnea. The breathing technique strengthens the muscles in the upper airway, thus reducing their tendency to collapse during sleep. It sure would be a lot easier than carrying that CPAP machine around. Anyway, let's listen to a didgeridoo just for a minute. Stop. Anyway, I bet you all thought I was going to snore for you. European exploration of Australia began with Dutchman Wilhelm Janszoon in 1601. For nearly 100 years, the Dutch came, but they never established permanent colonies. Most often, they were just shipwrecked on the west coast of Australia while they were on their way to Jakarta up in Indonesia. They called Australia New Holland. William Dampier was an ex-pirate and an author before he was court-martialed for cruelty. He became the first person to circumnavigate the world 3 times and was the first Englishman to explore parts of what is today Australia. In 1691, he spent 3 months on the northwest Australian coast. It seemed to him that it was just a long series of reefs and shoals. Behind that lay sandy hills and a barren country without water. He said it was inhabited by, quote, the miserablest people in the world, unquote. The next visitor of note was Captain James Cook. Cook, arguably the most famous explorer of his time, and that was back in the mid-18th century. After a successful early career, the British Admiralty chose Cook to lead an expedition to Tahiti. He also had secret instructions to find the great southern continent as well. He sighted land at the southeast Australia end and sailed north. Captain Cook was seeking a harbor where his ship's bottom could be scraped. He landed at a bay where his botanist, Joseph Banks, collected many specimens. So Cook named the area Botany Bay. That later became Sydney, Australia. The establishment of penal colonies in Australia was meant to alleviate overcrowding in English prisons. Sending convicts overseas was pretty common for those that had committed both major and petty crimes. Some 60,000 prisoners had already been transported to North America, but the U.S. Revolutionary War kind of ended that. Beginning in the 18th century, Britain sent their convicts to Botany Bay. 11 ships known as the First Fleet left Britain in 1787. 6 of the ships were filled with convicts. 2 were escorts and 3 were supply ships. The fleet arrived at Botany Bay and founded a colony, but they brought only enough food to last until they could grow their own. Along with the convicts came military and civilian jailers. Captain Arthur Phillips sailed in the First Fleet. It was his theory, and he preferred to reform rather than discipline the convicts. A little while later, the Second Fleet arrived, but that was even a disaster. It only had a few supplies, and it brought more sick and dying convicts. Since there were only a few people among all of those convicts that knew how to farm, food shortages soon reached a crisis level. Poor soil, unfamiliar tools, and climate further hampered the crops. It was clear that the area was not suitable, so the penal colony was relocated to a nearby area. This windmill, which doesn't have its blades anymore, is the oldest surviving structure in Brisbane, north of Sydney. It was built to grind grain. Convicts were forced to walk on steep treadmills when there was no wind to run the mill. The New South Wales Corps was formed to relieve the Marines who had arrived with the First Fleet. It consisted of pardoned, paroled, and released convicts who joined soldiers and sailors who had completed their military service. They were also known as the Rum Corps because of a monopoly that they kind of developed on imported alcohol. And the officers themselves within the Rum Corps were involved in a corrupt but lucrative rum trade. Soon, Captain Phillips from the First Fleet became Governor Phillips. He took the Marines and a surveyor upriver to what is Port Jackson today, a suburb of Sydney. Convicts were sent up there to establish a town. As the area grew, the name was changed to Sydney after Thomas Townsend. He was Lord Sydney in Britain and the Home Secretary who issued the charter authorizing the colony. In 1808, the Corps revolted and ousted then-Governor William Bligh. Everybody remember him? He was the captain of HMS Bounty when that famous mutiny occurred. The Corps hated Bligh because he was opposed to the illegal liquor traffic. Now that led to a short period of military rule, which was the only successful armed takeover of the Australian government in history. Well, by that time, more than 165,000 convicts had been sent to Australia. Well, unfortunately, though, the native population of Sydney had dropped to only 10% of their 1788 levels. Oh, by the way, William Bligh's log from the Bounty, remember the Bounty Mutiny, that's on display in a really wonderful museum in Sydney. This is a photograph that was taken by Dick Lubman. Thank you, Dick. In 1810, Governor Lachlan Macquarie arrived from Britain, but he and his wife preferred the clean air of the suburbs to the dirty, crime-ridden streets of Sydney. They remodeled the government house up in Parramatta into an elegant English house. Macquarie built public works, a bank, churches, and charitable institutions. He established very good relations with the Aborigines and set a policy where freed convicts were treated equal to free settlers. In 1823, a penal colony was established near Brisbane, north of Sydney. Patrick Logan became its commandant. He had a reputation as the cruelest officer in the country. Well, he was so bad that he was murdered. And it wasn't clear whether it was by his own guards or by a prisoner. Anyway, 10 years later, Brisbane's prison was closed and the town became a free settlement. All of the surviving convicts from the penal colony were returned to Sydney. The Rocks in Sydney were established early in the history of the colony. The original buildings were built with local sandstone, and that's how they got their name. From the beginning, it was a slum frequented by sailors and prostitutes, the upstanding people of the community. Bubonic plague broke out, and the government decided to demolish the buildings. Thousands of houses, buildings, and wharves were inspected, and hundreds were burned to the ground. Now, we're going to go a little history here. A billabong is a cut-off river bend that's found alongside a nice, slow, meandering river. Now, we can hardly finish talking about Australian culture without mentioning its most widely known bush ballad that just happens to take place at a billabong. Bush ballads are folk music and poetry tradition in Australia's outback. The rhyming songs, poems, and tales often relate to the itinerant and rebellious spirit of Australia, a young country. The most famous of these is Waltzing Matilda, the unofficial national anthem of Australia. The original lyrics were written in 1895 by poet and nationalist Banjo Patterson. The song narrates the story of an itinerant worker, or swagman, traveling the country looking for work. He carried his belongings in a swag called a Matilda, slung over his back. As his only companion, the swag was often personified as a woman, or Matilda. The swagman in the story is making a drink of tea at a bush camp by boiling water in a billy can. In 1903, the lyrics were altered for use as an advertising jingle for Billy Tea, and that made Waltzing Matilda a nationally famous song. The Billy Tea Company incorporated the famous "You'll never catch me alive," said he. Now for our famous motor vessel PVE stretch, stand, if you can, and join me as we sing. We'll just do the chorus of Waltzing Matilda, but it'll start a little before that. Some you lose. You did fine without the words. How many of you are from Australia? See? I know how you know how you identify an Australian? You go, Australia, oi, oi, oi! Yeah, well, unfortunately, between 1910 and 1970, some 100,000 Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their homes. They were known as the Stolen Generation, and the children were raised by white families. The rationale was that Aborigines were at a higher risk than other Australians for alcoholism, infant mortality, criminal behavior, and drug addiction. The expressed intention was the, quote, breeding out, unquote, of Australia's indigenous race to help the younger members fit into mainstream society. In reality, it was just ethnic cleansing. In 1956, the Australian military relocated Aborigines from their traditional homelands. The military planned to test-fire missiles into the desert. Land and property rights for the Aborigines fueled a civil rights movement of such in the 1970s. The Aboriginal Land Rights Act was passed 6 years later. The 1990s saw legislation that led to a great degree of autonomy. Increased wages and welfare benefits were guaranteed to the Aboriginal people. However, not all of them had been relocated. In 1984, a group of Pintupi, or Aboriginal people living in a traditional nomadic life, were found in the heart of the desert. Well, they were unaware of the arrival of the Europeans. They didn't know anything about cars or even anything about clothes. They were called the Pintupi Nine, and their discovery created a pretty big media sensation. There were headlines that referred to them as the Lost Tribe, and that simply annoyed them. They insisted they weren't lost. They were just separated from their relatives and other members of the clan. They knew where they were. Today, the country's formal name is Commonwealth of Australia. It was formed in 1901 when 6 independent British colonies joined together to become a new nation. The government there is a constitutional monarchy. That means the king or queen in England is the head of state. The ability to make and pass legislation resides with an elected parliament in Australia's capital at Canberra. It took 8 years and cost over 6 million Australian pounds to build the famous Harbour Bridge. As the Premier of New South Wales was set to open the span, a man on horseback rode across and slashed the ribbon with a sword. He claimed to have opened the bridge in the name of the people. He was opposed to government policies and resented the fact that the royal family had not been asked to open the bridge. And what would Sydney be without its most famous icon, the Opera House? It's become a symbol not only of Sydney, but of Australia. This building took 14 years to complete. It was opened in 1973 by Queen Elizabeth II. No man on horseback with a sword needed this time. The Opera House has 5 halls and drama theaters, and it's home to Australia's opera and the Symphony Sydney. Australia is one of our favorite countries and one we visited as often as we could get a gig. But now it's time to head for home. Sailing east from Australia, we cross the international date line. Let's go back in time to see how California, and in particular, the Bay Area, developed and grew. Trade, intermarriage, and military alliances fostered many social and economic relationships among the diverse groups of people here. Kalifa, depicted as the spirit of California, has been the subject of modern-day sculpture, paintings, stories, and film. Shown here is a mural of Queen Califia and her warriors. It hangs in the Room of the Dons at the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco. The word California was derived from the Latin Khalifa. That was taken from the Arabic word Kali, which meant religious state leader. The name California was first mentioned as a mythical island paradise in a Spanish romance novel that was written in the early 16th century. The island of California was described as a fabulous place with gold, griffins, and tall, strong women known as Amazons. This fictional land was described as being east of Asia. Oh, wait, we are east of Asia. California was settled by successive waves of arrivals during the last 12,000 years. The indigenous peoples included more than 70 distinct groups. One of the early tribes, the Digueno, lived on and near the rivers along southern California's coast. That was in an area that the Spanish knew as that poison oak place. Prior to the arrival of European explorers in 1542, estimates of the native population in California range between 100 and 300,000. If you think about that, that was about 1/3 of all the Native Americans in what is now the United States. California's native population declined quite rapidly, as did the rest of the country, mostly due to diseases that were brought by the Spanish. Juan Manuel de Ayala and his crew became the first Europeans to enter San Francisco Bay by ship. They sailed through what we know of as the Golden Gate in 1775, and they exercised great caution because of the currents. Ayala spent the next 6 weeks surveying and mapping the bay, and his report to the Viceroy described the geography of the bay. And he also mentioned the friendliness of the local Native Americans. But it was really Gaspar de Portola who discovered San Francisco Bay by marching up across land from San Diego. He named one island in the bay Isla de Nuestra Señora de los Angeles, or Island of Our Lady of the Angels, and today we know it as Angel Island. The Spanish established the Presidio at San Francisco as a military fortress in 1776. They wanted to protect their new settlement. That represented one of the first major efforts by Europeans to colonize the Pacific coast of what would become the United States. In the late 18th century, Mission Dolores was founded in San Francisco. Priests began to cultivate European fruits and vegetables there. They introduced cattle, horses, and ranching to the region. Today, this is the oldest intact building in the city and one of the oldest missions in California. In Southern California, Mexico was fighting for its freedom from Spain, and it was called the 1821 War of Independence. For the next 25 years, Alta California remained a remote northern province of the nation of Mexico. San Diego became the unofficial capital of Upper and Lower California. Originally, the entrance to San Francisco Bay was called the mouth of the Port of San Francisco. In 1846, John C. Fremont, the first military governor of California, wrote, "To this gate I gave the name the Golden Gate, for the same reason that the harbor of Byzantium was called the Golden Horn." He was referring to it being the door to great wealth. The Mexican-American War commenced soon after and lasted for 2 years. It followed in the wake of the U.S. annexation of Texas, which was not formally recognized by the Mexican government. Newly elected U.S. President James K. Polk saw this as a first step toward the further expansion of the United States. He sent troops to the area and a diplomatic mission to Mexico. After Mexican forces attacked U.S. forces, Congress declared war. Shown here is a map of the United States of Mexico. The tan area in the upper left was known as Alta California. Baja California is the blue-green area below that on the left side of the map, and that's where the Mexican-American War was fought. The settlers, though, rebelled against Mexican rule in what was called the Bear Flag Revolt, and that ended when a U.S. Navy Commodore claimed California for the United States. Go Navy! Another huge development was about to make the name California a household word. In 1848, James Marshall was leading a work crew building a sawmill for John Sutter. They were camped on the American River near today's Sacramento. On a cold, clear morning, Marshall found just a few tiny gold nuggets in the stream. "Gold, gold, gold from the American River!" shouted Sam Brannan as he paraded through the streets of San Francisco. He was waving a small bottle of gold dust he had purchased at John Sutter's fort. The result was one of the largest migrations in human history. Nearly 500,000 people from around the world descended on California. The promise of riches was so strong that crews on arriving vessels deserted and rushed to the gold fields. They left behind a forest of masts in San Francisco Harbor. Travel to California from the eastern United States was both time-consuming and dangerous, and most of it was done by ship around Cape Horn. Panama Canal would pretty much come about, and that would allow people to get to California faster, but there were other things that happened as well. Finally, on September 9, 1850, California was admitted to the United States as a free state. Entrepreneurs capitalized on the wealth of the gold rush. In San Francisco, Levi Strauss opened a dry goods business, and Domingo Giardelli began making chocolate. Other early winners were banking industry with the founding of Wells Fargo and the Bank of California. Immigrant laborers flocked to the city, and the Chinese railroad workers created Chinatown. Unfortunately, most of the people in the gold fields went broke at the same time. A more direct connection across the states came in 1869 with the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. It was financed by a group of Sacramento businessmen known as the Big Four. They were Leland Stanford, who was the president, Collis P. Huntington, who was the vice president, Charles Crocker, who was the construction supervisor, and Mark Hopkins, who was the treasurer. After that route was established, hundreds of thousands of people came west. The new Californians discovered that the land in the Central Valley, if irrigated, was extremely fertile for fruit and other agriculture. More people arrived with the completion of the Southern Pacific Line into Los Angeles in 1876. Oil was discovered 16 years later, and within 30 years, those oil discoveries helped California to become the country's largest oil producer, accounting for about 1/4 of the world's petroleum output at the time. Now, we're lacking just a few things to complete our story. Our new state needed a mascot. The saga goes that in 1889, San Francisco Examiner newspaperman William Randolph Hearst had a heated debate over whether grizzly bears still existed in California. Hearst pretty much ended the argument by challenging one of his assistants to go out and find one. After 9 months in the Sierra Mountains, they lured an enormous grizzly into a pen with honey and mutton. They named him Monarch after the old San Francisco Examiner, the monarch of the dailies. They transported the bear to San Francisco by sled and wagon and finally by railroad. Monarch and Company arrived to joyous parades and front page fanfare. He lived in captivity for more than 20 years and was California's last captive grizzly bear. After Monarch's death, he was stuffed, mounted, and given to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, where he is displayed today. 2 major civil engineering projects took place at the height of the Great Depression that made our region famous. The Bay Area began construction of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge. They were completed in 1936 and 1937, respectively. In 1987, the Golden Gate Bridge celebrated its 50th year anniversary with a pedestrian walkover. So many people walked out onto the bridge that the center span actually flattened out from its normal, very graceful arc. All right, now we're going to just kind of go back and take a look at our 2019 cruise. We set sail earlier in 2019 on this wonderful virtual cruise around the world, and we started in February with an overview about our life at sea. Then we presented a couple of maritime history tales, early sea travel and from steam to cruising, and that was followed by geology for travelers. You were to draw on this information from those talks as we pointed out things along our journey. Then we set sail on the beautiful motor vessel PVE. We sailed through the Panama Canal and on to the islands of the Caribbean, where we were raided by Captain Blackbeard, or Graybeard, not Blackbeard, Graybeard and his bride. Escaping that, we continued on to Brazil and the amazing Amazon before we sailed across the South Atlantic to West Africa, where we talked about cultural wars and diamonds. Once again, we were attacked by pirates, this time the 21st century kind that had moved there from Somalia. After that, we traveled to Greenland, Iceland, and Norway before going to Russia with love. Traveling south, we visited jolly old England, going to the Tower of London, Stonehenge, and the ancient city of Bath. Then it was off to Spain and Gibraltar, and then we sailed through the Suez Canal. Come on, go. In the Indian Ocean, we visited Kenya and Tanzania, or Tanzania if you prefer, with a side visit to the Masai Mara, where we participated in a cow bleeding ceremony. On to Oman and the United Arab Emirates before sailing to India, where we spent some time to understand the great variety of religions as well as the history and culture of the country. Lastly, we sailed to the land down under before turning this remarkable ship toward home. I hope you have enjoyed your virtual trip around the world. Susie and I sure have. Now, if there's a particular place you'd like to visit on our 2020 virtual trip around the world, please let us know. There are a few days left, actually 2 days left, so that you can click on the link that's on the homepage on Pulse. I think it was also in the last Friday Flash, to vote for the countries you would like to see covered in our presentations. And remember, time is running out, so vote as often as you want. What the heck? We're gonna total all that stuff up, and our virtual navigator will create an itinerary and we'll announce the dates and topics and all that kind of stuff. Now, does anybody have any questions about today's talk? Holy smokes. Yeah, Gene. The first fleet, yes. She said we're all the prisoners men, yes. The first fleet, they were all men. And then after that, somebody realized, well, that's not going to go very far. So the second fleet and the subsequent fleets, they brought women who were also convicts. And of course, when you think about convicts, you all think, oh, I don't want to have any of those people in my ancestry. But in Australia, that's considered an honor to be a descendant of one of the convicts that came over. And most of the convicts weren't, murders and stuff like that. Most of them were petty criminals that they just wanted to clear out of the prisons. So they weren't super bad guys. There were a few super bad ones, but yeah.
They know who sang Waltzing Matilda. Very popular in Australia. A guy by the name of Slim Dusty.
Yeah, Slim Dusty was the guy who really made it famous with the recordings of Waltzing Matilda. And if you listen to a recording of him, it really does kind of bring everything together. Anybody else? All right, well, I'll tell you what. As you depart, we're going to put together a song that kind of is dear to me about San Francisco. So have a great afternoon and evening, and enjoy the remains of the day.